being Putin, he always sticks with the old team. He's stuck with Gerasimov. Yep. And he's, even put his former bodyguard in charge of the counter operations in Kursk, Damyan and Alexei. And they got to such a state that within days of him announcing that, he said, "Oh, no, no, no. After all, it's going to be run by a committee of four, the defense of the Kursk pocket." And the troops are not mainstream troops. By and large, they're FSB, former KGB, in other words, security force troops, and Roskadia, National Guard Gendarmerie. So there's something that really isn't working there.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we are joined by a defence editor with 55 years experience as a broadcaster and journalist. Robert Fox has reported from several conflicts, including the Falklands, the First Gulf War and the Balkans. He's worked for the BBC, the Daily Telegraph and authored many books. He is now the Evening Standard's defence editor. Robert Fox, welcome back. Great to see you again.
Yes.
With just over 3 weeks distance from the Ukrainian offensive into Kursk Oblast in Russia, what is your assessment of the Ukrainian strategy, what it's achieved and how effective it is?
Well, the jury's out on this because although both President Zelensky and Colonel General Syrskyi have been making statements to the press rather belatedly, and who can blame them, and they've said it's really to relieve the pressure on the central front. It certainly hasn't done that. But it's certainly doing something because they have shown that Russia, even with its resupplies from Iran, from North Korea, is not winning the drone war. Although it's attacking like mad with these multiple bombardments of infrastructure, dams, the hydro stations, and very much going for the civilian infrastructure, it's not getting through to the extent that it should. If you launch 200 drones and missiles and you're getting up to 80% of them knocked down, something isn't working. I think actually what we're really doing, it's very important, we're waiting for the next stage, which comes quite quickly. It's what goes on in the next 10 days to 3 weeks. And it's the depth battle. It's the battle that supports the bombers, and it's the battle that supports the resupply, both on the central Donetsk, Luhansk front and in the Kursk pocket. And that's where they're having a tough time, the Ukrainians, but they're far from losing.
At the moment, as things stand, today, Thursday, the 29th of August, it's being judged as a very risky but bold but risky move, I should say, by the Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's armed forces. Why do you think he would do it now?
He's rolled the dice. And remember, it's not only a kinetic war, a war on the ground and a war in the air, it's an information war as well. And this is something that he, and particularly Budanov, the director of intelligence and the director of an awful lot more, including the psychological warfare, and he is really very sophisticated and has learnt the lessons from last year. They're trying to undermine the confidence of Russia at a grand strategic level. They're playing mind games with Vladimir Putin. And that is, from what one gathers, it is having some success. There's a much less confident Putin. He's going all over the place. Let's work on this front and that front. What are we going to do in the Baltic? What are we going to do with Moldova? What are we going to do to upset the elections in Georgia? Watch this space.
It's really interesting because it does seem in response Russia has resumed these intense series of drone and missile attacks on Ukraine, in particular on its energy infrastructure. Why the concentration on this, for example, rather than a pushback to defend inside Russia itself?
This is very difficult because it's still on the offensive. You've got a tale of two offensives, peculiarly at the moment. You've got the Ukrainians going into Russian territory in Kursk, as we've been discussing, and we've got the push forward around Pokrovka, that and the Chavy Yar axis to push to these hubs, which do control a big logistics junctions. They're working on that. But they're using old tactics. They're using heavy metal, they're using a lot of infantry, and there's a lot of controversy, which the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian psychological warfare is playing on very heavily, that they're bringing up conscripts and getting conscripts to sign on as trained soldiers, which they are far from, because this is absolutely clear. They understand this and they will work on it, the Ukrainians. Putin does not want to have a general mobilization, a general declaration of martial law. It's a military dictatorship anyway in Russia, but he doesn't want to state the blindingly obvious, because if he states the blindingly obvious, and our friend Zakharova, she's the wonderful gobby spokeswoman on foreign affairs, on public national media, if they have to say, well, we are at war now and we need a mass mobilization. Well, what the hell have you been doing for the last 2.5 years? It hasn't been going so well. I think that that's the message that the Ukrainians are very keen to get through. It's not going so well because most of Russia is still not touched by the aspect that they're in a messy situation, which is making their lives worse.
The slow advances towards Pokrovsk in the Donbass continues, and President Zelensky likened that this week to the battle for Bakhmut and said Russia would throw tens of thousands of troops at it should it want to. Do you think that President Putin will do this because he actually needs a battlefield success right now?
He's got to do an audit, and he must be doing it, but one doesn't know who is informing him. What is the value of the commitment of troops there? Really, how good is the ordnance, the logistics, the chain, the defense industrial aspect of it? It's going gangbusters, so much so that currently the Russian economy is assessed at being growing by 3%, but it's an artificial growth. It's based entirely on this ramping up of 40% of all public funding is going towards defense at the moment, and really that should produce a war machine which should utterly overwhelm Ukraine, and yet it's not working. Of course, the Russian defense is it's the Weasley West. It's all these wonderful weapons, but in fact they're not as copious as they're made out to be. So to look at Putin's got to find a winning strategy and a winning team. And being Putin, he always sticks with the old team. He's stuck with Gerasimov. Yep. And he's, even put his former bodyguard in charge of the counter operations in Kursk, Damyan and Alexei. And they got to such a state that within days of him announcing that, he said, oh, no. After all, it's going to be run by a committee of 4, the defense of the Kursk pocket. And the troops are not mainstream troops. By and large, they're FSB, former KGB, in other words, security force troops, and Roskadia, National Guard Gendarmerie. So there's something that really isn't working there.
You write that if fighting continues at this rate till the end of the month, both sides risk running out of steam and resources, pointing what's going on in Donbass, but also what's going on in Kursk Oblast. And you point to splits in the leaderships of Kyiv and Moscow. What are those splits exactly?
Well, the splits are roughly those that I've described. Putin is now, it's actually ready to sort of change the metaphor and make it easier. It's gangsters. It's a gangster war because you get cliques, and you get even in the Ukrainian forces this is going on. It's very interesting that even such an august organization that has been copious in its coverage of the Ukrainian war, like The Economist. I'm sorry to single it out, but it has been so important and so dominant in this, and it was all for Colonel General Sirsky, that he was the genius that was seeing everything. They were leaking gossip, The Economist, that Sirsky should be sacked. What is going on there? That in fact, it's very interesting, because I think of the genius of people like Budanov, that how Western media have got involved in the internal mind games of what is going on in this war. And I just have to say this because this is so important on what Syrskyi and Budanov see as what went wrong last year. A hell of a lot went wrong. The summer offensive, which cost a lot, didn't come off, and they blame primarily this, that they blabbed, that they briefed the Western Allies leadership, and they leaked to their press, and their press said, "Oh, the attack is going to come on Kherson from the west of the front. So June the 6th, what happens before it can start? They blow up the Russians blow up the Kharkovka dam. And apart from the nuclear threat, which we should go into, which is enormous, it's the biggest ecological disaster in the area, in the region, since the Chernobyl meltdown of 1986.
Frontline's in-depth coverage of the war in Ukraine is made possible by Times Radio. Please help support our work by downloading the Times Radio app, the link's on screen now, and tuning in through the day to keep up to date with the latest news and thought-provoking discussions. So since you mentioned the influence of the media, I want to just ask you something slightly related to this, which is the charges in France against the Russian-born CEO of the messaging app Telegram. Is that likely to have any impact on the war and the way it's communicated?
Yes, it's thrown another complication into the picture, because he is accused, because of the underground messaging that goes on, that it favors organized crime. Telegram, of that can be small doubt. It favors pornographers, even child traffickers, but it is also the way that Russian dissidents communicate. So if it's upon one thing or the other, but I think that he's been arrested in France, or detained in France, and he's under house detention. It's a thing that, particularly that code of law that happens in Italy, that you can do. It's a caution. It's a warning. You're under investigation. It would happen in France anyway, because actually he's a dual citizen of France. But it is one of these things that is actually bigger even than the Ukrainian war, because you see that somebody like Elon Musk has sided with him. You're attacking the freedom of expression on social media. Even Zuckerberg has got involved in this. But what is so worrying, and it's going to be prominent again in the American presidential election, is the lack of quality control on these media, because Musk himself, ally of Telegram, has downgraded media accuracy, probity checks on X, formerly Twitter. So it's a huge ground. I see a lot of it. I know I'm only seeing probably less than a tenth of the battleground, but a very real battleground it is too. And by the way, that when there is a real breakthrough in social media in Russia, I think that's when Putin himself gets in trouble. But remember, thinking of a year ago, the thing that really shook Putin was Prigozhin, was Yevgeny Prigozhin's sort of pantomime coup. But Prigozhin was the master of the troll factory known as the IRA, the Internet Research Agency. So it is right there, and it's absolutely clear. Harris, as well as Trump, have been warned that by the CIA, by the Intelligence Committee of the Senate, that the Russians will be using social media in the election campaign. And it shows you that none of these conflicts, Gaza, the West Bank, Ukraine, what's going on in sub-Saharan Africa, what is going on in Libya, Sudan, and Somalia, they're all connected somewhere.
Let's just return to the situation directly in Ukraine. And in response to the onslaught by the Russian military by drone and missile attacks on Ukraine in recent days, the US has now said it's going to prioritize its air defense exports to Ukraine, surge energy equipment to repair its systems, and strengthens the resilience of its energy grid. How effective is this part of the Russian campaign proving in driving Ukrainians from their homes or even out of the country?
What I understand is that, of course, you can't have full air defense cover. When you think Ukraine is roughly the size of France plus half of Germany, it's an enormous territory. It would be the biggest country in Europe. save Russia, but a lot of Russia's bulk is actually in Asia, as you know. It is a very big country, therefore very difficult to defend. And yes, America would say this, but I think the real game that they've also got to match that with is strike into Russia, where I was looking up the figures just this morning again. Now there are hundreds of drones being launched each week into Russia from Ukraine. And if Ukraine can hang on, it's developing its own ballistic missiles, making them themselves. So Britain, America, and France don't have a say-so whether you can use a long-range weapon or not. By the way, I understand that they're being told, now you see me, now you don't, that more or less they're being permitted to use Scalp, better known to us as Storm Shadow, into Russian territory.
So okay. First, a couple of things to unpick there. It's test fired. Ukraine's test fired its own ballistic missile. It's going to be a while potentially, isn't it, before it actually has it? And
Never
can
say
use...
that about Ukraine. Never say that about
Yeah,
Ukraine.
that's true.
Look at the innovation. Do you remember the Bayraktar T2, T2, the Whiz Turkish drone? It was completely used very effectively by the Ukrainians in the opening stages of the war back in 22. It was completely out of date, completely outmoded, completely overtaken, even by particularly by Ukrainian technology, within months, if not weeks. And they are they shame a lot of the Western countries, and particularly the British defence industry set up, in the adroitness, the astuteness with what they're doing, and particularly down at the front. Ballistic missile next year, don't count on it. I'll bet they'll have a really good go at doing it this year.
Okay, so President Zelensky, and we again this week we've had repeated requests from the Ukrainians to be able to be used Storm Shadows to hit inside, to get that permission to hit inside to Russia. You're saying you think that's tacitly kind of on the cards, right?
Yes, because I think what Zelensky will bang on about, and who could blame him, is getting permission to use the various American equipment like ATACMS. Certainly, they've been using multi-launch rocket system, I would think, in the Kursk battle. So they've been going into Russia. But there is the AGM-158 JASSM, JASSM, which is more powerful than Taurus, the German version, and Storm Shadow. They'd really like to have a bit of a go at that. But what can I just quickly say that I think Zelensky is brilliant at this, because you have to think he's talking a lot about this. Let's work out what he's not talking about. And I think in air defense, they're beginning to get the F-16s really working.
Yeah, and we saw them working, didn't we, to defend Kyiv only in the last few days, in perhaps a small way, but it is starting, and that they were used to counter these drone and missile attacks.
And that's primarily their role. Their role is not deep strike. Then they're not going to use them, I would think, primarily in a fighter bomber role. The F-16 is amazing plane because it has been, over its history, incredibly versatile, and you can use them for a deep strike, but that would be expensive and it would be risky. What they want them for, I would suspect initially, as air defenders, to bring down the Sukhois coming in and launching standoff weapons. But they've got to go even further back. These heavy bombers, the Tupolovs, that are coming up from bases well to the east of Moscow, which is a sign of some success of the Ukrainians, is that they're forcing the air bases further and further back. I would say, before we talk next, I think watch for a bridge or two more to be dropped. I'll bet they really have a go at the Kerch Bridge again and try and cut off Crimea.
It's going to be a good chat next time, isn't it, Robert? But let's carry on with this time for the moment. So on those attacks on Kyiv, the recent in the last few days, we have also seen the former Ukrainian Minister of Economy posting pictures on X, purportedly showing the Kyiv hydro dam being hit, and the dam holds. But he said if it hadn't, it could actually put a significant portion of Kyiv underwater. Is your assessment the same as that? How serious is this?
Well, I have to be honest. Since the war, I haven't been there and seen that. You have to you have to worry about this thing. The fact that he's put it up, he's sending some kind of signal. But I don't want to do the usual politician's trick of answering a question by asking another. But there are huge infrastructural problems, if I can put it like that, because Mr. Grassi of the IAEA, went to look at the Kursk facility, still technically, well, it's very much so in Russian hands, but under threat in the war zone. But they're very worried about Zaporizhia as still. We have had Mr. Plochy, Professor Plochy, the great Ukrainian historian from Harvard, who's written yet another book, and he thinks the nuclear threat has in no way diminished. He is very worried because of his recording of the whole story of Chernobyl, which of course was ploughed up again in this conflict, even the casual attitude of Russia to nuclear safety. And there are big, big things. But what I think that as we come up to the meeting of the General Assembly this great season of September, every September, I am concerned that the Western allies are going to be encouraged also by their media to step back. They'll be obsessed by Harris-Trump. Instead of seeing what a good colleague and friend of mine, Francis Tusa, has posed as a question, if by accident, because the fighting is still so intense, we could get ourselves absolutely without seeing it, rather like the Houthi attacks on the international shipping, which was not foreseen at all, we could get ourselves into what Francis calls an Article 5 moment, where by hook or by crook, by mistake or intent, Russia and its allies attack a NATO country. I think it is extremely possible. I am not sure how the West in depth, how well prepared and how well configured it is to meet that.
What kind of scenario do you envisage?
I think it would probably be Baltic. I think it would be with the Baltic states. I think it could be with Kaliningrad. It would be something like that, or something silly, a miscalculation with the use of force by Russia to press their case and their parties and their support in Moldova, because you're very, very much on the NATO doorstep there. Hitherto, Putin has been very careful, despite all the rhetoric, not to provoke a direct attack on or by, with or from a NATO frontline power. And there are NATO front lines, and the NATO front line has got closer to him, which is a terrible mistake, a strategic mistake already that he's made with this war. He got Finland and Sweden into the NATO alliance, virtually turning the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake. It's exactly the same thing that we're seeing in parallel, curiously, with Iran. It is clear that neither Russia wants a full-out confrontation, nor does Iran want, at this stage, a full-out confrontation. But the possibilities of accident, the occasions, the strange mistakes and turns, they proliferate by the day at the moment.
And every time we have these concerns about nuclear use of nuclear weapons, for example, you hear from Belarus on this. And interestingly, when you were talking earlier about President Putin's kind of almost scattergun reaction to what's going on in Kursk Oblast, you also have, in conjunction with this, Belarusian troops building up along the border with Ukraine. Is this part of a useful diversion and part of a way of him just trying to work out the way to develop his strategy going forward?
No, it's a man who's absolutely obsessed with tactics to save the moment of the moment, and I think it's symptomatic of no strategy. Because if he is going to commit Lukashenko to the battle and he's done his bit of rhetoric, but not much more, frankly. He hasn't got much of an army, and the Ukrainians have warned them off, and that's where he could trigger an insurgency, an insurrection inside Belarus itself. There is in this, because he had very good ties there, a Prigozhin element. That's where you could get the next Prigozhin mutiny, funnily enough, because there are Wagner forces there and they're pretty fed up.
It's interesting that you say that it could trigger some kind of insurgency in Belarus, and like literally in the last few hours, we've heard this news about a Shahid drone being shot down over Belarusian airspace, which is Russian. I mean, how's Kremlin going to react to that?
Well, they, I will bluster, and I would say initially they will ignore it. But what you will have, and I said, well, you have to think of the mind man as well as the thinker and the leader. You have to think of Budanov. If this has shown a weakness, oh boy, the Ukrainians are going to exploit it. They're going to do something with it. And by the way, this is the great thing strategically. If we want to, with Putin, is he's so thin with allies. He's been going round and round. He's tried to call in the Shanghai Conference allies, tried to call in, been visiting the Caucasus, sending overtures to Georgia. But not one of the stans has really stood up to help him in the special military operation, save for the warlords and gangsters from Chechnya, led by the clan of Ramzan Kadyrov. He has very little local sympathy, empathy, support. And the further east you get, which is critical, they say, don't mess with us. We don't want your problem. And China, above all, is saying that. And I think that there's some kind of negotiation diplomacy, a real gambit being launched by Zelensky at the moment, and somehow what the gesture he made at Kharkiv has got something to do with it. But and he knows the one capital which will really decide will say enough already, because it's damaging what we need to do and the way we see our security and the way we see our position in the world, and you're just a bit player in it, is China. And I think it's when China finally gets fed up with Putin, which I'm pretty sure it really will do, because his position is very Trump-like at the moment. It is getting less and less coherent by the day, and I think that's where I think things will come to a head. I think we will have some kind of negotiating position, and I do get the sense of smell that Zelensky has got could come out of the back of the UN General Assembly, but don't count out diplomacy now.
So, Robert, President Zelensky is linking the Kursk operation to the second peace summit in November and saying it's one of the stages to end the war. We can talk perhaps about his plan to deliver that maybe another time when there's more fleshing out of all of it. But at this stage at the moment, how do you think the most likely way is that the war will end?
I think it will end. It has to, in some kind of political settlement. Whether it can be done with the two principals still on the stage, Zelensky and Putin, is really open to question. But what really has to be examined is the support from the West. With either a Biden 2 or a Harris presidency, there will be less interest in Europe. But it is like the old adage about war. You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And I think a Harris presidency looking to the Pacific, Californian based, will find that out very, very quickly. The binding of America and Europe is absolutely essential. It will have to be refreshed, renewed, but they will not be able to walk away from the Ukrainian conflict, which is what the Trump rhetoric has been saying up to now. But boy, we are getting a tremendous lesson from the Ukrainian forces, the conduct of their war machine for the reform and restructuring of Western military formations, Western military structures, probably the British more than any of them.
Robert Fox, great to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now or listen to Times Radio or go to thetimes.co.uk. My thanks to our producer, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye for now.